So in this video I would like to talk a little bit about my own personal synthesizer history, and in particular my relationship with one particular synthesizer, and this is, in my opinion, one of the great unsung digital synthesizers of the 1990s, the Yamaha SY77. Now, if you haven't heard of the SY77, I'm not totally surprised. It seems to have disappeared from view or flown under the radar for the last decade and a half, or maybe the last 2 decades. If you have heard of the SY77, then you definitely get an A+ on your synthesizer history paper. The SY77 was released in 1989, but to understand why I think it was such, and still is in many respects, an absolutely brilliant synthesizer, we need to go back a little bit and look at its progenitor. We need to go back and look at its progenitor, the Yamaha DX7, which I am sure you have almost certainly heard of. The DX7 was released in 1983. In the UK, it was priced around £1,500. It was around $2,000 in the US. It was one of the first really successful digital synthesizers and sold over 200,000 units. It also was one of the first synths with MIDI, and it was also one of the first synthesizers to forego the analog knobs and sliders that we have over recent years come to appreciate in favour of an LCD screen and so much menu diving that it really ought to have been issued with a scuba diving outfit. Most musicians found it impossible to program. It was a totally different method of synthesis to the analog synthesis which we had known before. And famously, Yamaha did report that of all the units they got back for service or repair, 99% of them still contained the original factory presets. However, there is no denying that this synthesizer was absolutely revolutionary, and the sounds it produced based on FM frequency modulation synthesis and produced clear digital sounds that we had never heard before. It has featured on countless, probably thousands upon thousands of recordings, and so popular was the DX7 even now that it has been immortalized by several companies producing software emulations of it. My favorite is probably the one in our Arturia's V collection. The DX7 spawned a DX7 II and several other DXFM variants. Now, although the DX7 was brilliant, I was probably one of the few musicians who never bought one because it didn't tick all the boxes. And this is where it gets a little bit personal. I was a gigging musician at the time, and there were 2 things I wanted from a synthesizer. The first, I wanted to sound like a band, so I wanted strings and brass and piano and trumpet and flute and guitar and all those sort of acoustic sounds which would make me sound like a band. And the DX7, it didn't really hit the mark. But there was another thing which I wanted from a synthesizer as well, which we will come on to in a moment. Now, just out of interest, although I didn't buy a DX7, I did buy a Casio CZ101. And this used a process of synthesis called phase distortion, which is really very similar to FM synthesis. I'm not going to get into the technical details. FM could do a little bit more than phase distortion, but I bought a Casio CZ101 and I got a lot of the same type of FM sounds out of it, so that was fine, and it was a lot cheaper. Okay, let's fast forward to 1989 when Yamaha launched the SY77. Now, what was so special about the SY77? Well, it was based on FM synthesis, so you had all the FM goodness of the DX7, but it also included samples. So this combination of FM and sampled sounds which could be used together in all sorts of different ways, it meant that the SY77 was capable of producing a vastly larger range of sounds than the DX7. However, it wasn't simply a matter of putting the DX7's FM synthesis engine together with these samples. Yamaha called the FM synthesis in the SY77 AFM or advanced FM. So without getting into any technical details, the SY77's FM engine supported more algorithms, and it could also be combined with the samples, the PCM samples, which Yamaha referred to as AWM. There's a lot of acronyms going on here. Advanced Wave Memory, or technically Advanced Wave Memory 2. So it could produce a far greater range of sounds, and that really was the bottom line. As well as producing the hard digital crystalline sounds of FM synthesis, the SY77 could also produce organic sounds and really, believe it or not, very analog like sounds. The combination of this synth plus samples was known as synth plus sample synthesis, or convolution synthesis sometimes. I'm sorry, there are a few jargony words floating around here. So certainly at the time it could produce very realistic instruments, sounds, strings, brass, guitars and so on. So this ticked the first box for me as a gigging musician. Now the second thing I wanted was a synthesizer I could use in my studio. We were heading into the 1990s now, and I had got rid of every piece of equipment in my 1980s studio and was building up my 1990s studio. If you're curious about what was in it and what I did with it, then I will leave a card up here somewhere, and there will be a link in the description to my 1980s studio and my 1990s studio. But one of the main things I wanted from a synthesizer in the 1990s, I wanted it to be multi-timbral. Now, if you're not 100% sure what that is, well, I'm not totally surprised, because we have seen very few multi-timbral synthesizers over the last few years. But if you break down the word, multi, multiple, many, timbral, timbre, tone, sound, many sounds, a multi-timbral instrument is simply one that can play many sounds at the same time. And the SY77 was 16-part multi-timbral, which meant, yes, you could play 16 parts on it at once. Now, this was in the 1990s. We didn't have DAWs, digital audio workstations. The computer power which we had back then was just simply not up to the task of recording and editing and playing back digital audio. But we did have MIDI. And in the late 1980s and through the 1990s, I used an Atari ST computer, the first and probably I think the only one to feature built-in MIDI ports. And I was using a very early version of Cubase and an early version of Celeb's Notator. Celeb became eMagic, they were bought out by Apple, Notator became Logic, and the rest is history. Now, as a gigging musician, I was very comfortable with reading the dots. I liked working with music notation, so Notator had better notation facilities at the time than Cubase, so I tended to do most of my work in Notator. So what I could do was set up 16 MIDI channels in Notator and assign each channel to a different sound on the SY77. Now you're probably thinking, oh, big deal. You've probably got access to dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of tracks in your DAW. But this was the 1990s, and this was really revolutionary, being able to program individual notes, to edit individual notes, not audio recordings, and create a multi-part song. This was absolutely revolutionary, and I used the SY77 throughout the 90s and into the 21st century. I have lots of examples of pieces of music written solely with the SY77 on this channel. I will link to a few in the description if you want to check them out. And just to give you a little bit of a break from me talking about this, I will put a few very short extracts of some of those pieces throughout this video. And you can skip them if you want. Now the SY77 did have a built-in 16-track sequencer, but it was early days for digital synthesizers. Manufacturers thought it was fine to have a screen and buttons and do lots of menu diving to program the thing. So I did program a few songs into it, but not very many, and it was far easier to control it and use it through MIDI from a computer. Now, if you're curious about the difference between the SY77 and the DX7, there is a fantastic post by RoboTunes on Vintage Synth Explorer, which I will leave a link to in the description, and he lists about 10 ways in which the SY77 is different from the DX7. So if you're interested in that, I would urge you to check it out, and you will see how and why the SY77 is and was such an absolutely powerful beast. Now, it was no easier to program than the DX7. In fact, it was more difficult because there were a lot more options. And I'll be absolutely honest, I did very little programming. I did a little bit of tweaking, but diving into those menus and adjusting numbers, it really did nothing for my creativity. However, there were dozens and dozens of really clever people who knew how to program it. So I just used to use ready-made sampled packs from a range of different people. Now, I do think that Yamaha missed one trick, because the patches from the DX7 were not directly compatible with the SY77. There are thousands and thousands of DX7 patches available for free on the web. However, there were, certainly at the time, and probably still are available, conversion software programs which will convert the DX7 patches into an SY77 format. Now, I gigged heavily with my SY77. It was built like a panzer and weighed an absolute ton. I did have a flight case made for it, but with all the lugging about over 10 or 12 years, it did inevitably get a few knocks, and parts of the case cracked and one or two little bits sort of splintered off. Because of the heavy use, the legend on the buttons started to wear off, but the instrument continued to perform absolutely perfectly. And I will say, just out of interest, that it had one of the best synth action keyboards that I have ever played. Now, in the early years of the 21st century, for a variety of reasons, I decided to take a rest from music and pursue other projects. So I sold all my 1990s studio equipment, down to the last MIDI cable. However, for some reason, which now I cannot quite understand, I kept the SY77. Perhaps I thought it might form the basis of a new studio if I got back into music again, which I did around 10 or 12 years later. So when I did get back into music, I was totally in the box with Native Instruments' complete control system. And it's only over the last year, really, that I have started to acquire some hardware synthesizers. So I thought it was time to take the SY77 out of its box and see if it would fit in. So I did, and to my disappointment, but perhaps not total surprise, the disk drive had stopped working, and when I switched it on, the presets had disappeared and it just made weird FM noises. Now, after some consultation, it was decided that quite probably the rubber band driving the disk drive had perished. Now, we are talking 30 years on, so that is hardly surprising. And also, it was decided that quite likely the battery had died. Yes, these things had batteries in them. Now, these could easily be replaced. There are videos on YouTube showing you how to do it. Replacing the disk drive belt is a little bit fiddly, I believe. To replace the battery, you have to remove a printed circuit board, unsolder the existing battery and solder in a new one. Now, I would normally have been able to do this, but as I mentioned in a few other videos, my eyesight is not very good, and this was something which I just simply was unable to do. So I looked for a synthesizer engineer, preferably close by. I really did not fancy transporting this to another part of the country. It would have required a forklift truck. I only found one, and he was not taking any orders because of COVID. This was in 2020. So being stuck between a bit of a rock and a bit of a hard place, I decided the only thing to do was to sell it and make the best of a bad job. So given its condition, plus the fact that it had a few chips and the legend on the buttons had worn off, it was difficult to charge any reasonable amount of money for it. So I did sell it for an absolute pittance. But the guy who bought it seems a very nice guy, and he was into FM synthesizer, and he already had a DX7, and I think he already had a SY77. He was used to tearing them to pieces and replacing bits. So I'm sure he would take this and fix it up, and he would have another SY77. So that is a bit of a sad story about me and my SY77. Now, if you're intrigued by the SY77 and wonder if it's worth buying as a vintage synth, well, I did a quick check of the relative prices of DX7s and SY77s on eBay and Reverb before I made this video, and the prices don't vary, surprisingly, an awful lot. DX7s tend to be around 400, 500, 600 pound. And SY77 can range from around 300 to 325 up to around 500. I think if you could get an SY77 in good working order for 300 or even 400 pounds, I think it would be a good buy. But just a couple of caveats, we are talking about instruments which are probably 30 years old. So even if it is in perfect working order, the chances are, if the disk drive belt has not been replaced, that will need doing at some point fairly soon, especially if you start using it very much. And it is almost certain that the battery will be very close to needing replacing. You can, or at least you could, get replacement LCD screens. For some reason these seem to stop working. Mine was working perfectly. And you can get nice blue ones which look a lot better and a lot clearer and a lot sharper. And at one time certainly you could get replacement buttons if some of the legend had worn off them. Now, the legend of the SY77 is still alive and well today, because a lot of the technology pioneered in the SY77 is still used today in one form or another in Yamaha's montage series. So in an ideal world, I would have had an SY77 here so I could demonstrate it and create a song with it. But alas, I didn't have the foresight to realise that I would have a YouTube channel at this time. Otherwise, I might have made videos of the SY77 20 years ago. Instead, there are other videos on YouTube about the SY77 with people demonstrating them and playing the sound. So if this is something which interests you, then you can check it out. But for a good example of what it can do as a whole, playing many parts at once, then again, I could just point you to some of the pieces I have on this channel with the links in the description. Now, if you have any questions, my memory of the SY77 is not going to be particularly good since I really haven't used it for over 20 years. Feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them, although I suspect you might get a more accurate answer just by using Google. Now, just as a final note, although I think the SY77 was and still is a brilliant synthesizer, there was a little twinge of sadness when I sold it, but I have lots of new toys to play with, so I'm a fickle synthesizer user. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting and perhaps sparked your interest enough to go and find out a little bit more about the SY77. So if you did find this interesting, then please do consider subscribing to the channel, because it really does help and give me some incentive to carry on producing videos, which I hope you will continue to watch and enjoy. Subscribe, ring the bell, so you get informed of new videos as soon as I release them, and click the big thumbs up. That always helps as well. But as always, I really do appreciate you taking the time to watch my videos, so for that, thank you very much indeed, and I will see you again in the next one. I'd just like to play you out with this very short extract from my Piece of Angels album, which was created entirely on the SY77. It's a very ambient, very relaxing, chill out piece of music, and if you want to hear the whole album or hear more of this, then click on this little box here. I hope you enjoy it.